If you'd like to open your Bibles to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. I've had many experiences in life that have put me ill at ease that I probably should write a book about at some point, except I don't like writing all that much, so I probably will never do that. But there was a time when I was singing in an a cappella group, and we were doing a concert, and a guy from the group a cappella, that was kind of the pinnacle for us as we looked to what we were trying to do, was sitting on the front row, and we absolutely bombed. It was awful. And it was the one time when I sang in that group for 3 years that we actually had to stop a song completely and try to start over again. And then we tried to start over again and bombed the song a second time, and then just moved on to the next song. There was a time where I got up at a Sunday night as the fill-in preacher at Westside and Searcy. Our regular guy was out that week, and I was the youth minister at the time, got up to preach, and I looked down, and sitting right around here was Jimmy Allen. And if you don't know the name Jimmy Allen, he was kind of the Billy Graham of Churches of Christ back in the late 60s. He filled the Dallas Convention Center one weekend for an entire weekend meeting. He's been involved in the baptizing of about 10,000 people. And here was substitute preacher, youth minister me, Jimmy Allen sitting on the front row, and I thought to myself, I want to be anywhere other than here right now because I'm not capable of doing this. I will tell you, coming into talking about marriage today, when I woke up this morning, I thought I should tell my wife to visit another church today. Because if you happen to catch her on the way out, she could tell you about how she's going to need a recording of this to remind me of things from time to time. Because I am not good at most of what I'm going to talk to you about. At the same time, I understand it is very important that we try to be better than we are. So a few things as we start. First of all, this is one of those topics that I feel like I'm not the best equipped person to talk about, but we'll try to muddle through that together. Secondly, I understand that within our group, there are lots of different places you're at when it comes to marriage. There are some of you that have always wanted to be married and just that has not worked out for you. There are some of you who have been married and it went horribly and you're no longer married. There are some of you that were married for a good long time and your spouse has gone on before you. There are some of you in very happy marriages right now, some of you that are not, and some of you that when you see marriage as the topic that's coming, you wish you had visited another church today too. And I get all of that. I will say there's a lot to learn about marriage this morning, but there's also quite a bit to learn about how we interact with each other. So if you don't feel like, well, a marriage lesson doesn't really apply to me, I think you can still draw something this morning. So I hope you'll stick with me through it, and we can learn a little bit about God and how he wants us to treat one another. So in Mark chapter 10, we'll start in verse 2, and I want to remind you of why we're doing all of this. We have been looking at these descriptors of the early church, basically. And the way Timothy Keller puts it is we need to get back to a Christian apologetic. And he's not talking about science versus religion or any of that stuff. He's talking about the early church thrived because there was something about them that was very different than the culture that they lived in. And these are the 5 things he narrows it down to. We've talked about 3 of them so far. We talked about the church being multi-ethnic several weeks ago. We talked about how we care for the poor. We have not talked about them being non-retaliatory yet, but we will come to that at some point. We talked last time, I guess 2 weeks ago, about how they valued life. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what they had as a revolutionary sexual ethic, which the world in which we live today would laugh at that idea because they feel like they've figured out all of this so much better than we have. But at the time in which the early church began, what they did when it came to the value of women, what they did when it came to marriage was very different than the world around them. And we'll see that, I think, really start to come to the surface here in Mark chapter 10. Starting in verse 2. It says, Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, I want you to consider the question they ask, because it's the question that is what do I do when it all goes wrong? And we tend to go into things in life that way sometimes, especially the pessimists and the cynics among us. We tend to get something and we immediately are thinking about, what happens when this doesn't work out? And so lawyers in our culture nowadays have built careers around this kind of thing. No offense, Jack. But there's so much legality in stuff that people tend to think of all of the ways we need to make sure this is going to be okay. So when you see commercials nowadays, especially drug commercials, you will see all kinds of things happening in small print at the bottom of the screen. And there's always my favorite line. There's Eliquis, that's a blood thinner thing that's out now. And it's all the allergies. Don't take this if you're allergic to this, 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 and this. And the last line is always, do not take Eliquis if you're allergic to Eliquis. Which always makes me laugh because I think, who would do this? And the answer is someone. Someone would try it, and they would find out they're allergic, and then 5 years later they would think, maybe I should try that again. And it doesn't work out again. And they've tried to cover all the bases of what happens when it goes wrong. So the Pharisees, as they come to Jesus, have this question of what happens when it goes wrong. But I believe they're going a step beyond that. They're doing what a lot of people in their culture would have done, which is not necessarily so much what happens when this goes wrong, what happens when we don't get along anymore, what happens when we fall out of love, all the terminology we might think of today. I think they're speaking more in terms of what happens when I'm tired of this? What happens when I want something different? What has God made for me then? And again, as they ask this question, it's partly for them, but it's also partly, as Mark tells us, they want to trap him in something. And they will learn the lesson throughout the Gospels that you can try to trap Jesus, but it rarely works out well for you when you do. In verse 3, he answered them, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. So they understood the what. Okay, here's the thing that needs to happen. What did Moses say about that? And so Moses said to do it in this way. Now, even the way that Moses said within his culture was a much kinder way than what was going on. Now, we would look at this as people who respect marriage and think that marriage is something that should last for life. And we would think, well, why would Moses give them such an easy out? Why would God in the old law give them the ability to just write the certificate of divorce and be done with things? The culture around them, it was much harsher than that. And they would gladly just get rid of a woman altogether, put her to death, be done with her, or have as many women as they would like. And you would see that creep into the people of God throughout the Old Testament. A lot of times people in our culture today will say to you, well, they had multiple wives in the Bible. I challenge you to find God suggesting that. Usually what you find is men as they have fallen and men as they have tried to find their own solutions go in directions that God never really intended. You go all the way back to the beginning and you find that God has created this one woman for this one man all the way back in Genesis. And so they understood the what, and they understood the process, even though they were asking him about it. What they didn't understand was the why. And we're that way a lot when it comes to rules, aren't we? We understand the what of rules. We understand the what of processes. We don't always understand the why behind it. And why God did it is what Jesus would tell them about, which honestly is probably not what they were expecting. In verse 5 he said, Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. It's not about the wife you're tired of. It's not about the wife that you want to walk away from. It's not about the wife that you look at the world and the culture around you that can have things however they want it. It's not about that. It's about your heart that all of this happens, because God knows hearts. God understands the things within your heart that are saying to you, I'm ready to walk away from this. And although this is a message that Jesus is giving them in answer to a question 2,000 years ago, this is every bit alive in our culture today, isn't it? We look and the statistics say that roughly half of marriages end in divorce. And we would like to think that if we move into churches that that's going to drop drastically. And I hate to tell you this, but it doesn't. It's a little less, but it's not significantly less. And even within churches, so many marriages end in divorce. Now, I believe we are blessed at a place like Southwest to have lots of examples of the opposite of that. If we had all of our folks here this morning, and I know a lot are still careful at home right now, but if we had all of our folks here this morning and I were to ask them who here has been married for more than 50 years, you would see a lot of hands go up. And you would see a lot of hands in their living room this morning go up. It's an unusual place for that. And you see less and less in that in the world we live. God understands our hearts. And our hearts say there's always something better out there. The grass is always greener, is the way we hear it now. There's something that will give me more pleasure, give me more joy, and if I will seek that out, I will be happier. And so I need to get rid of these things that do not cause me joy. And none of us set out for that. When you had that great moment long ago when you decided to go out and buy a ring, when you decided to set a date, when you picked colors and tuxes back in the old days and dresses and all of those things, there was no intention of the Pharisees' question here. How do I get rid of all this? But life happens, and a lot of people find themselves there, and it's because of the heart. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Now, I want you to think about this, just a quick sidebar here for a second. I know we're talking marriage, but just about creation for a moment. We struggled with this too in our world today because our world will tell us the earth is 4.3 something billion years old. The world will tell us it all happened with a big bang. They will show us how we came from one-celled organisms and all this stuff. And I don't want to get off on a big tangent this morning, but I do want to tell you, whatever you may think of creation, whatever our world may think of creation, Jesus sure does reference it like it's historical fact quite a bit, doesn't he? I know it happened in Old Testament days. I know it happened long, long ago before Jesus walked the earth at least, although he was there, John tells us. But he references it like it's a thing that happened. And I hope we will consider that as we consider creation. There's your sidebar. We'll move on. This was God's design from creation. Marriage was not an idea that Jesus kicked up in Mark 10. Marriage is not an idea that the church developed somewhere along the way that we find in early church history. They decided to start doing this thing. Marriage goes all the way back to creation. God creates man, recognizes that it's not good for a man to be alone, and comes up with this design for marriage where there's a man and there's a woman and they spend life together. And if you think those 50-year times were a long time, by the way, look at the genealogies back in Genesis. How about those 900 years of Adam and Eve? Year after year after year, these people who are together. And also consider within creation, God's goal there at creation was to populate the earth. He creates one and then a second. Are there not a lot easier ways to populate the earth? What if he had created Adam and 10 Eves, or Adam and 20 Eves? Wouldn't that population go on a whole lot more quickly than it did? And yet God creates in his design one man, one woman to be together. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. And the two shall become one flesh, so they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. The two become one. And that relationship then takes precedence over all the others. I know you like mom and dad, and I know for us here at Southwest, a lot of the mom and dads are still here. But it's husband and wife first. I know you like your kids, and they're great people. I like my kids most of the time. But it's mom and dad, husband and wife first. That is the relationship that takes precedent over everything. Jesus would teach it, and we see the example of it all throughout Scripture. So where does this take us? Ephesians 5, and this is usually where we will begin when we talk through Ephesians 5, especially if we're talking marriage, is in verse 22. I want to remind you, as I do often, and if you're visiting here, I remind our church here at Southwest quite a bit. If you're watching around the world this morning, we talk about this a lot. Back when the New Testament was written, when these were just letters written to churches, letters written to people, they did not have chapters, they did not have verses. This was the letter from Paul to Ephesus, and you had this entire 6 chapters of Ephesians, all as one letter. And if you were the Ephesian church, you probably did not read chapter 1 and put down the rest for later. You did not read the headings that were put there in the NIV somewhere along the way and save the rest for later. You read the letter to the church at Ephesus, and then you passed it on to someone else to read. And so in Ephesians 5, it's easy for us to take 22 to the end and say, well, that's about marriage. Someone at some point in a Bible put a heading there that tells you that. I want to challenge you to move back a few verses. Because what you may not realize when we get to chapter 22 and that favorite verses of husbands everywhere, wives submit to your husbands, do you know that if you were to go back to the Greek New Testament, which most of us won't because most of us don't read Greek, but if you were to go there, do you know if you looked at Ephesians 5 and verse 22, there is no verb in that verse? It is assumed from the preceding verses. The word submit does not appear in the original languages of Ephesians 5 and 22, which means we get it from the context that comes right before it. Now, it is solidly what it means. There is no one that disputes that. But if it is inferred from the previous verses, shouldn't we see how it's used in the previous verses? So we're going to start at verse 18 and kind of see where it goes and then go from there. And do not get drunk with wine, that is, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Wait a minute, that verse we use about singing and how we sing, it comes from here. singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father and in the name of the Lord of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. When we submit, we honor Jesus. Submission honors Jesus. And you will notice that submission is introduced here in this section to one another. I watched a sermon of a preacher on TV, I guess on YouTube, not too long ago, and the way he described this was, we should be in a submission competition. I like that. We should be trying to out-submit one another. Now, the beauty of submission, too, is what our culture will tell you is that submission equals weakness. Why? Because if you watch wrestling like I did when I was a kid, it's all scripted, I've been told. I don't believe that. If you watch wrestling, or if you watch the UFC or things like that nowadays, which I'm not recommending to you, but I know people do, one of the things that can happen to end one of those matches is submission. And it's when the guy on one side has finally had enough and doesn't want to keep being just beaten on by the guy on the other side, and so he will show the ref that he wants to submit. And we view submission as weakness. Submission in the New Testament was power. Because if you were going to submit, that means you have the power, the decision-making ability not to. Because the culture in which they live, and where we're about to go here in verse 22, the culture in which they lived, all women were without that power. Now, you may have some people in royalty and some people way high up that be the exception to the rule, but for the average woman in the first century, if your husband wanted something, that's what happened. Or, like the Pharisees mentioned, they get rid of you, because that's what they do in their culture. So that's the reason why it's important for us to look back here at these verses before verse 22, because a woman in the first century would assume submission, and probably would assume a little more than that, because it really wasn't a conscious decision she could make. That was just how culture worked. So when Paul then says in verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, all of the wives out there reading this would say, well, yeah, that's how our society works. We don't have another option here, Paul. But Paul has just said in the preceding verses, because he starts earlier than we normally start when we talk about this, that we're submitting to each other. There is a submission that is going on among us out of respect for one another. Now, Paul is going to lay out some of the roles of husbands and wives, and I get all of that. But understand that when he says submit, wives submit to your husbands, and our world looks at that and says, that is arcane, that is old-fashioned. How can you live that way? Women, how can you put up with that in the world in which we live, where feminism and everything else has told you that you don't have to do those things? Understand that when Paul writes this to the church at Ephesus, this is revolutionary. The idea that a woman would have any power in the decision to do this was completely unheard of. And so the God who our world would look back at 2,000 years later and say is telling you to do something old-fashioned and making you lesser was giving women a power that they never had before. Was telling women that you have the ability to submit to your husband. And then goes on to explain it. Because submission, one thing, submit how? What are we talking about here, Paul? For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to everything, in everything, to their husbands. So how do we submit? We submit the way the church submits to Christ. We understand as a church that Christ is the head, that the things we are here to do should first of all please and honor Jesus. Now, I know we know that. I know we read these verses in Ephesians and we agree with them. I also know sometimes that we have a tendency to put our own wants and desires above that, although we would never say that out loud. Sometimes the things we want in our minds, whether we would ever really acknowledge it, seem to push above what Jesus has said. And Paul would remind us of that here too as a church. We have to remember that Christ is in charge of the church. And so wives, submit to your husbands the way that the church submits to Jesus. But then it's not over. Husbands, love your wives. Love your wives. And we could think of, this is the same Paul who describes love back in 1 Corinthians 13 and all the things love is and all the things it is not. all of the things it always does, all the things it does not do, and he would tell us how we go about loving. But if we are to love our wives, how do we love them? What's the example he's going to give here? As Christ loved the church. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her with the washing of the water, with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So how does Christ love the church? I know we have the obvious way of what we've celebrated this morning, but think a bit for a minute about how he describes Jesus' love for the church. It is a love that is sacrificial. He would do anything for the church. And as husbands, we should be willing to sacrifice whatever we can for our wives. And that will take lots of different forms. Fortunately for most of us, it won't be something that comes down to death and that kind of sacrifice. But there are a lot of things that we may want a particular way that we need to sacrifice. There are a lot of things we may desire that are important to us that we know our wife feels differently about, and we have to take that into account. And again, as we think about this kind of love for wives, revolutionary in Paul's day and time. This is something that people did not do. The church is set apart. Christ loves in such a way that the church is set apart and above everything else. The church is honored. When are those opportunities that come along that we as husbands can honor our wives? And if we're not doing that, by the way, we need to be. There are so many things we get excited about in life, so many things we want to share with people. What about when there's something that is a way that we can honor our wives? Do we look for those things? And made holy. We want to make sure that our wives are right with God as Christ wants to make sure the church is right with God. This love that Jesus has for the church is just a completely selfless, putting the church above kind of love. And that is the love that he wants us to have as well. And that is a love that so much in the first century was foreign. Wives were property then. Wives were something that was there for a task then. And in our world today, even though the world around us would tell us, you don't value women, think of what marriage should look like within the church. Think of how we want to value women within the church. And I think we could very easily turn back around to our world and say, you're not looking closely enough. Because look at what's going on in the world with women versus what happens here. And it's very, very different. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Are you starting to notice yet, by the way, if you haven't noticed before, that there's just that one little piece at the beginning about wives submitting to their husbands, and then a whole lot of advice for husbands and how they should treat their wives? I think Jesus understands something that he relays on with Paul here, who understands and writes it through the guidance of the Spirit, that us guys need a little help from time to time. I will tell you, at times I get offended by that. I will watch TV show after TV show, especially the old comedies where there would be a husband and wife relationship and the guy always looked like a buffoon. And I think to myself, why does the guy always look like the dumb guy in all of this? And then I'll look at myself on occasion and think, oh yeah, that's why. There's an understanding that we need to know a little bit. And we keep going back to that submit verse, and it's there, and we don't ignore it, but there's an awful lot that comes around that. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. We are to love our wives as we love our body. Now, I know for some, this one seems kind of weird to us, but understand that generally you're looking for your own physical well-being. You may not do it as well as you would like to do it. You may look at your body on occasion and think, this needs some work. But at the same time, we generally try to keep ourselves alive. And that concern that we have is the kind of concern we should have. And that concern we have, by the way, is daily, isn't it? You know, for those of us who have to take medications, those medications are a daily and sometimes multiple times a day kind of thing. And when you forget, you want to make sure you take care of that. I'm horrible about taking medications. I've joked with my wife lots of times that if I ever have to have one daily, we're in serious trouble if you don't remind me, because I will probably die at some point. I get vitamins. They always go bad before I finish the things. But for most of us, we understand with our own body, we got to take care of it. And that's something that takes regular effort. I heard one time a story of a wife who told her husband, "Why don't you ever say I love you anymore?" And he said, "I did." She said, when? And he said, you remember back when we got married? I said it then. I haven't changed my mind. So if I change my mind, I'll be sure to let you know. It does not work that way, guys. It's a constant, daily effort that we have to be doing more. And again, I hope my wife is not taking too many notes today because this is no good for me. Verse 31. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This was countercultural then in Ephesus. The family that preceded you, they were very big on ancestry as we are today. And all of those forefathers that you may have had, they were very important, and you didn't leave all that behind. And then more than that, the idea of the two being one, no, the husband's a little more one than the other, and the husband is very much in charge of things. And if the husband gets tired of that, the husband moves on to something else, or if the husband wants another, the husband gets that. That's the world in which they live. It was countercultural then, and I will tell you it's countercultural now too. We as Christians have been called to live a life that is countercultural. The world around us has one set of values, and we have a very different set of values. And the world around you, when it comes to you and tells you it's old-fashioned and arcane, I would encourage you to reply to them, this is revolutionary. Because if all of you could get this, if all the world around us could get this, how much better would things be? You know, we're told so many times that this stuff is old-fashioned that we almost start to get defensive about it. We live our lives in our way, and we're not going to let it stop that. But it's almost as if we don't want to say things too loud because people are going to assume, oh, you just don't get it. You don't get what the world is like. I believe that as people who follow God, we get what the world is like a whole lot better than the average person does. Do you understand that if it is a one-woman, one-man relationship that lasts throughout life, how many headaches have been saved during that? Even on the difficult days, even on the days where it's a struggle, how much easier life is. And by the way, the reason that it is because you are doing things as it was designed to be done. You are doing things the way that God created things to happen. When I was a kid growing up, my grandfather had a shed out back. The shed was, as I recall it, about a 8x10. It was a yellow metal building with kind of a Quonset airplane hangar style roof. It was the most incredible place for a 7-year-old boy to go hang out. My grandfather was a gunsmith. He built guns back there. He would sit there hand carving the stocks just to make them just perfectly with these flexible rulers. I would sit back there and I would reload ammunition for him. That was my job as a 7-year-old. I was putting gunpowder in and measuring it just right. I was putting the bullet in the shell and bringing the press down and all of that. I thought that's what every 7-year-old did. And life was good. And there in that shed, he had the biggest tool chest I have ever seen, with all of these little drawers, with all the little gun parts, and as you got further down, a little more of the household tools you and I would have. And there were screwdrivers and wrenches and pliers and hammers and all of that stuff. Do you know what happened when something would break inside the house? We were roughly 80 feet from the door of that shed. Something would break inside the house. My grandfather would say to me, "Go get the butter knife." And I would look at him and say, "You've seen the tool chest in the shed, right?" I mean, I grabbed the key, I could run out there and I could grab, you have screwdrivers of every size that you could possibly want. And he'd say, "No, it's a flathead, go get the butter knife." And I would go and get the butter knife and he would try to do whatever with this screw he needed to tighten or loosen with the butter knife. And sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. And more often than not, we would have butter knives in our drawer that were all bent to pieces because he had tried a little too hard to make that thing work. The more I look back at that, the more I laugh, and occasionally I will get the butter knife out too, although I have found if you put a screwdriver in another drawer about 2 drawers away, you can just use that instead. It was designed to do something. Our world has taken the marriage which God has designed and turned it on its ear. Our world has taken marriage that God designed and turned it into something that lasts a year or so and then goes by the wayside. I could spend the next hour telling you about our first year of marriage and all of the crazy things that happened. We'd been married less than a month when one of us got the flu and the other got the chicken pox. And I thought to myself, this is not how this is supposed to work. This is not what I read in the books. few months later, we lost a child. A few months after that, we were pregnant with another one. We both changed jobs. We moved into a new place. It was a crazy year. And I could tell you a lot more. And I will tell you, for a lot of people in our world, at some point in the midst of that year, it's enough. And we have looked back at that many times, and we've had struggles since then and great times since then. We've looked back at that many times and said something along the lines of, if we could make it through that year, we're good. So many in our world never get there. Our world has taken this thing that's been designed between a man and a woman and redefined it over the last few years. God never redefined it. Our world has taken this thing that's intended for life and made it into something else. It's not meant for that. Whatever marriage is for you today, I would encourage you, take another look in the book and see what God had in mind. And if your marriage is not that, I truly believe it begins here in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians 5 gives us just about everything we need to know about our attitudes toward each other, about the way that we interact, about our respect for one another. Ephesians 5 gives us the keys that we need. And it doesn't end in verse 22, although that's part of it. It ends with love and respect. And notice, by the way, it's different things for husbands and wives, because we have recognized many times throughout life, we're geared very differently. We have different needs, different things that make us tick. And for wives, at least the way Paul puts it, it's love. And when you exercise this kind of selfless love that Jesus has for the church, how can a wife not be in love with that? And then from the other side, from the husband, respect. What is it about men that we need respect? And I get that all this is generalizing. I get that maybe sometimes this flip-flops in your relationships. I understand that. But generally speaking, there is with one of us a need for love and the other a need for respect. I've told you before, I can't mow the lawn without making a comment about it as soon as she walks through the door. Doesn't the lawn look great today? I need someone to notice. When things go well, I need someone there that shows me that. And for her, she needs love. And sometimes I'm not great at showing it either. And sometimes a lot of us aren't. Like that guy in the story, we've never changed our minds. We just don't say it or show it enough. And God wants that for us. And God shows that to us through his Son. This morning, if you have not followed him and need to be baptized in him for the first time, you can begin that walk with him and see what that sacrificial love is all about. Or if you have fallen away, I know this is kind of a weird sermon for the come back to Jesus time. This may be a little more of the you and your wife, you and your husband need to have a different conversation on the way home than you usually have on the way home. And remind each other just how much you matter to one another. Remind each other just how much you care, how much you love, how much you respect. And for those who are not married, for those who are in different situations, know that that love and respect that we see in marriage is one that extends into our other relationships as well. We should be people who care about one another, people who love one another. If there's any way your church family can help you this morning, please come while we stand and sing.